The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. In the hidden corners of prisons across the US and Europe, some inmates believe they had found the perfect way out. Blueprints drawn in pencil, smuggled tools hidden behind loose bricks, silent promises made in dim cells by men covered in gangster tattoos, convinced destiny owed them freedom. But in the world of real prison escapes, one tiny miscalculation can flip everything. This documentary dives into the most shocking failed escape attempts, from the Dannemora breakout in New York to the Pentonville escape in London. Cases where planning, patience, and desperation collided with reality. Each chapter exposes how these men came close to rewriting their fate, only to watch everything collapse under one fatal mistake. Today, you'll see the truth behind what happens when jailbreaks go wrong. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The blueprint of failure. Every prison escape starts with the same seed: the belief that the walls aren't as strong as they look. Inside correctional facilities in both the United States and Europe, that belief has pushed inmates, often lifers with nothing left to lose, into building the kind of plans that seem foolproof on paper. But the moment a single detail slips, everything unravels. In 2015, Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, became the stage for one of the most publicly dissected escape attempts in modern history. Richard Matt and David Sweat, both heavily tattooed and deeply embedded in the prison's undercurrent of gang-affiliated culture, spent months building a silent partnership. Their plan wasn't spontaneous. It evolved inside the routine boredom of prison life. Cold mornings, identical schedules, and endless nights listening to pipes groan behind concrete walls. Their idea was simple: outthink the system. Sweat's mind worked like a map: angles, distances, guard rotations. Matt was the talker, charismatic, manipulative, someone who could convince almost anyone to bend a rule or look away. When they approached a civilian employee inside the tailoring shop, they didn't start with threats. They started with trust, flattery, and subtle manipulation. Eventually, the boundaries blurred. A smuggled tool here, a helpful favor there. That's how every escape begins, not with cutting fences or sprinting across fields, but with exploiting human weakness. The first mistake they made was believing that the system couldn't recognize patterns. Matt, tattooed from wrist to shoulder, had already built a reputation for pushing limits. Sweat, though quieter, carried the kind of intensity that officers were trained to look twice at. Still, months went by without serious suspicion. They chipped at walls, moved pipes, and rehearsed routes in their minds. Piece by piece, the plan became real. Across the Atlantic, in London's Pentonville prison, a similar pattern unfolded. Two inmates, both covered in tattoos, signaling years spent in the criminal underworld, used a smuggled diamond-tipped drill to cut through their cell bars. They crafted fake bars made of cardboard and toothpaste, painted to match the originals. Their planning reflected the same principle. If you make the impossible look ordinary, no one questions it. What connects Dannemora and Pentonville isn't geography, motive, or the crimes that brought these men inside. It's the one fatal assumption every escapee makes: the belief that the outside world will stay as silent as the prison at night. In reality, once an inmate steps beyond the last bar, the clock becomes their enemy. The world moves fast. Technology moves faster. And any trace, a footprint, a camera blind spot used too many times, a tool borrowed from the wrong workshop, can set off a chain reaction. At Dannemora, Matt and Sweat finally slipped into the prison's guts. Steam pipes, tunnels, and maintenance corridors that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. But a small oversight derailed them. A guard failed to perform a required bed check. Not because he was alert, because he was tired and cut corners. The empty beds, crafted with makeshift dummies, went unnoticed. That moment bought them time. It didn't save them. Once the escape went public, the manhunt became one of the largest in New York history. Hundreds of officers and tactical teams swept the dense woods around the prison. Matt, impulsive by nature, left signs everywhere, discarded food, footprints, brief sightings. Sweat kept moving, calculating, but the wilderness didn't reward careful thinking. Hunger, exhaustion, and terrain pushed him toward mistakes he wouldn't have made inside prison walls. Back in London, the Pentonville escape collapsed under a quieter and more humiliating flaw. One of the inmates bragged, not to guards, but to other prisoners, men who overheard whispers and saw unusual behavior. In prison, secrets don't last. Information becomes currency, especially when dealing with inmates who owe favors or want reduced pressure from officers. When the officers finally inspected the cell closely, they realized the bars were fake. By then, the escapees were already gone. But their run didn't last long. CCTV, travel patterns, and digital analysis trapped them faster than any guard ever could. The common thread between these escapes is the same thread that has doomed nearly all others: trust in the wrong person, miscalculation of time, or one overlooked detail. Matt and Sweat trusted a civilian employee who later became the weakest link. The Pentonville escapees trusted each other, but underestimated the inmates listening around them. In both cases, the system didn't stop them. Their own choices did. What makes these stories powerful isn't just the drama of the escape. It's how close they came to success. These weren't chaotic breakouts. They were structured, planned, rehearsed. Months of work undone by seconds of error. And when the errors started, everything fell apart fast. The lesson is clear. Every escape begins with confidence, but ends with reality. The helpers who turned into weak links. Every major prison escape, no matter how bold or technical, shares one unavoidable truth. No inmate breaks out alone. Behind every tunnel, cut bar, or smuggled tool is a helper. Someone on the outside or inside who cracked under pressure, bends the rules, or gets pulled into a world they never imagined themselves part of. And in almost every failed escape, that helper becomes the weakest link. In the 2015 Dannemora escape, Joyce Mitchell became that link. A civilian employee at the prison's tailor shop. She wasn't a guard, wasn't trained for high-risk manipulation, and had no criminal ties. But months of subtle conversations, harmless favors, and emotional pressure changed her worldview piece by piece. Matt, with his heavy tattoos, charming personality, and ability to read people like open books, saw her weaknesses immediately. Sweat, quieter and more disciplined, followed Matt's lead. Together, they approached Mitchell with the precision of seasoned manipulators. What outsiders often misunderstand is how rare it is for inmates to use force to gain help. They don't need to. Manipulation works better. Matt showered Mitchell with attention she wasn't getting at home. Compliments, emotional stories, small gestures. Sweat added structure, soft talks, calm presence, the sense of being someone she could trust. By the time the planning reached its peak, Mitchell was transporting hacksaw blades and frozen hamburger meat. She wasn't threatened, she was convinced. That emotional involvement wasn't unique to Dannemora. In other prisons across the U.S., civilian workers, teachers, medical staff, counselors have been pulled into inmate schemes without even realizing they crossed a line. The inmates know how to spot loneliness, boredom, insecurity, or anything they can use to get what they want. Tattoos, muscles, and hardened behavior may create a physical barrier, but the true weapon is emotional strategy. Pentonville had its own version of a weak link, except this time it wasn't emotional. It was procedural. The inmates relied on a guard who consistently rushed his rounds. In prisons, routine becomes predictable, and predictable behavior becomes exploitable. The guard wasn't corrupt or convinced. He was careless. He took shortcuts, passed cells without checking properly, and ignored small details that should have set off alarms. The inmates counted on that laziness as much as they counted on their tools. Inside every prison, whether in New York, London, or anywhere else in the world, the staff faced constant fatigue. Long shifts, understaffing, high tension. The slightest lapse, One glance skipped, one assumption made, one lock checked too quickly, creates cracks in the system. That's what escapees look for. Not courage, not opportunity, just cracks. But these helpers, intentional or not, eventually become liabilities. Joyce Mitchell began feeling the pressure long before the escape happened. She was supposed to pick up Matt and Sweat after they crawled out of the prison's infrastructure. That was her role, the getaway driver. But the night of the escape, guilt and fear hit her like a wall. She didn't show up. The inmates waited in the dark, hiding near a manhole cover, listening for her car. It never came. Her fears saved her from becoming part of the fugitive run, but her absence forced the escapees into the woods without a plan. A single person backing out shifted the entire direction of the manhunt. What should have been a quick disappearance became a slow, sloppy survival attempt. This pattern repeats across prisons globally. Helpers willingly participate up to a point, and then reality hits. Consequences become clear. The risk becomes tangible. Many back out, panic, or confess. And when they do, the entire escape collapses. Inside Pentonville, the weakness wasn't emotional, it was structural. The guard sloppiness eventually caught the attention of other officers. When new staff examined the fake bars, they realized they had been cut days earlier. Had the rounds been done properly, the inmates never would have made it past the cell. But even when escapees get lucky, even when helpers create temporary openings, the freedom gained is fragile. Another major flaw in helper-driven escapes is trust. Criminal networks inside prisons often rely on tattoos to identify affiliations, gang loyalty, territorial symbols, long histories of violence or survival. But no matter how intimidating these symbols look, inmates still gamble when they decide to trust someone. Matt and Sweat trusted Mitchell to show up. The Pentonville escapees trusted that their guard would remain lazy and that no one else would notice. But trust is a fragile currency. One moment of hesitation or suspicion can unravel months of planning. The broader system also responds quickly once helpers are identified. In Dannemora, the minute investigators found inconsistencies in Mitchell's story, they pressed her hard. Under pressure, she admitted everything. That confession gave authorities insight into the planning process, the route, the methods, and the motives. The manhunt changed direction instantly. What was once a blind search became targeted. The same thing happened in London. Once the fake bars were discovered, staff reviewed footage and guard logs. Patterns surfaced: missed checks, inconsistent movements, sloppiness. The escape narrative became clearer, and pursuing officers pieced together the escapees' likely exit points and direction. These failures raise a deeper question. Why do helpers crumble so easily? The answer is simple. Helpers aren't criminals. They're ordinary people pulled into extraordinary risks. When faced with legal consequences, media attention, and the reality of assisting fugitives, they fold. Their panic exposes details. Their interviews reveal cracks. Their confessions dismantle escape routes. Another reason helpers fail is that inmates overestimate their loyalty. Emotional manipulation works inside the prison walls, where life moves slowly and relationships become intensified. But outside, where the consequences are real and immediate, the helper's perspective shifts fast. Fear becomes stronger than loyalty. For every major escape attempt, the downfall begins not with guards or fences, but with the same pattern repeating through history. A helper who panics, hesitates, or breaks under pressure. Escape plans crumble not because the system is perfect, but because human nature is unpredictable. The one mistake that ends everything. Every prison escape, no matter how elaborate, disciplined, or perfectly rehearsed, always ends the same way, with one mistake. Not 10, not 5, just one. It can be a sound, a footprint of a wrong turn, a brag, or a moment of panic. And in the world of real escapes, that single moment becomes the difference between disappearing into the world or being dragged back in handcuffs. In the Dannemora escape, that mistake was noise. Sweat and Matt had rehearsed their movement through the steam pipes for months. They mapped every inch of the prison's underground infrastructure. They waited for guard rotations. They knew when the pipes hissed loud enough to cover their work. But on the night of the escape, one of their actions produced a metallic clang that echoed slightly louder than usual. Under normal circumstances, that would have meant nothing. Prisons are full of strange noises. But 2 shifts earlier, another inmate had filed a complaint about banging near the workshop area. Small detail, not treated as urgent, but it triggered a conversation in the guardroom. When the escape happened, that memory influenced how officers responded. One clang created a chain reaction. Across the Atlantic, the Pentonville escape hinged on another simple mistake. A camera blind spot that wasn't as blind as the inmates believed. They had studied the guard patterns, the timing, the placement of cameras, and the daily movement cycles of staff. But they misjudged one lens, a fisheye security camera that captured a distorted edge of the area they thought was safe. The footage wasn't clear. Faces were blurred, but the presence of 2 tattooed silhouettes moving where no inmates should be was enough to spark suspicion when investigators reviewed footage after the escape was discovered. This is the pattern. Escapes aren't stopped by brilliant detective work. They're stopped by small, overlooked details. In 2018, in another European facility, 2 escapees made it all the way to the outer perimeter. They had cut through a fence, jumped a wall, and slipped past a guard tower during a shift change. Their downfall came from something embarrassingly simple. One of them dropped a glove. The glove was old, torn, and covered in tattoo ink stains from prison-made tattoo sessions. But inside the glove was a piece of metal they used to pry open a lock. That metal contained microscopic fibers from their bedding. Prison forensic teams matched the fibers to their mattresses within hours. One glove, one mistake, entire escape compromised. In nearly every escape that failed, the mistake was avoidable. But inmates often forget how aggressively the outside world reacts once an escape is confirmed. The moment an inmate breaches the last gate, time becomes compressed. Authorities move fast. Surveillance networks activate. Air support is deployed. Heat sensors come online. The world shrinks for an escapee. Matt and Sweat underestimated the environment they ran into. Forests near Dannemora are dense, but they're also patrolled heavily. Their tattoos made them identifiable, forcing them to stay covered even when the heat became unbearable. Matt's impatience created the next mistake. He made noise in the woods, moving too fast, leaving behind food packaging, breaking branches. That gave tactical teams direction. Sweat's mistake was pride. Instead of leaving traces minimal and movement strategic, he tried to outsmart the manhunt by changing patterns repeatedly. But unpredictable movement is easier to detect than predictable movement. Authorities noticed gaps in the search grid, areas between sweeps that were unusually quiet. They adjusted their search map based on where Sweat wasn't, rather than where he was. That shift in strategy closed the gap on him. In Pentonville, the biggest mistake happened after the escape. One of the inmates called a friend using a burner phone. The number wasn't registered, but the call location was. Authorities triangulated the incoming signal to a specific row of flats. They didn't know which apartment, but they knew the building. That alone created enough pressure that nearby residents began reporting suspicious activity. Men with heavy tattoos, wearing dark hoodies, entering stairwells at odd hours. The escapees were caught less than a week later. Technology makes mistakes bigger than they used to be. In the 1970s or 1980s, an escapee could vanish into another city with little more than a haircut. Today, movement patterns, digital footprints, CCTV networks, license plate trackers, and facial recognition, even blurred faces, create digital trails that grow with every step taken. Another common mistake comes from trust, especially among inmates covered in tattoos, signaling gang affiliations or survival histories. Tattoos inside prisons often indicate loyalty, rank, or history. But during an escape, those symbols become liabilities. Anyone who sees them remembers them. Anyone describing an escapee mentions them. Even blurred CCTV footage picks up the shapes of tattoos on forearms or necks. In one U.S. escape attempt in the early 2000s, an inmate almost made it 2 states away. His mistake? He wore a sleeveless shirt at a gas station. A customer noticed his tattoos, distinctive gang symbols tied to his case. A quick online search matched the description to an active manhunt alert. Police arrived within minutes. Small, simple, preventable. Another common error is overconfidence. Escapees assume their discipline inside prison transfers to the outside. But inside, life is predictable. Schedules repeat. Risks are controlled. Outside, everything is unstable. Every movement requires improvisation, and not all inmates can adapt fast enough. Many commit mistakes simply because they panic, make impulsive decisions, or assume authorities are slower than they actually are. Across cases in both the U.S. and Europe, the timeline is consistent. Most escapees are caught within 48 hours. Not because they lack planning, but because the real world is filled with variables they didn't rehearse. Weather, cameras, civilians, traffic, hunger, injuries, fatigue. The environment exposes every weakness. In every major escape that failed, the final collapse started with a moment so small it almost didn't matter. But in escapes, small things matter the most. One noise, one wrong turn, one camera angle, one mistake. That's all it takes. The manhunts that rewrote the story. When an inmate escapes, the story stops being about the prison and becomes about the hunt. What begins as a breach quickly transforms into a full-scale search that pulls officers, helicopters, dogs, tactical teams, and entire towns into the chaos. Escapes don't end at the wall. They explode into the world outside, and the manhunts that follow often expose more about the system, the community, and the escapees than the escape itself. In the aftermath of the Dannemora breakout, New York State launched one of the largest manhunts in its history. Roads were shut down. Checkpoints appeared on every highway. Nearly 1,000 officers flooded the forested terrain around the prison. Helicopters circled constantly. The woods, already dense and unforgiving, became a battleground of patience and attrition. Sweat and Matt weren't just fugitives, they were targets. And every passing hour tightened the noose. Manhunts operate on patterns. The first stage is containment. Officers assume the escapees haven't gotten far, so they lock down the perimeter. At Dannemora, the terrain complicated this step. The Adirondack region is filled with thick forests, swampy ground, abandoned hunting cabins, and winding back roads that lead nowhere. But it also meant Matt and Sweat had to move in terrain that exposed their weak points. Tattoos that once empowered them inside prison now became liabilities. They had to stay fully covered, even when temperatures and humidity made breathing difficult. The next stage is pressure. Tactical teams push forward in sections, clearing ground inch by inch. They leave no space uncontrolled. The sound of boots, dogs, and helicopters becomes constant, and pressure creates mistakes. Matt made several. He left food wrappers in the wrong place, broke branches, stepped in a soft mud that captured the pattern of his boot. Sweat, more disciplined, left fewer traces, but pressure eventually forces movement, and movement becomes visible. Across Europe, manhunts follow similar patterns. After the Pentonville escape, London rapidly transformed into a surveillance grid centered around digital tracking. Unlike the forest chase in New York, the Pentonville hunt unfolded in a city network packed with cameras. Every alley, bus route, tube station, and side street became part of a digital funnel. Investigators weren't searching blindly. They were analyzing, reviewing, predicting. The city worked against the escapees. Tattoos that could be hidden in the woods became glaring identifiers in crowded urban spaces. A silhouette caught on a shop camera. A hooded figure with a familiar gait. A blurred arm with ink showing through. In a world where cameras see almost everything, even blurred footage becomes evidence. Another major shift seen in global manhunts is the involvement of civilians. Authorities release limited details, just enough description to alert the public. In both Dannemora and Pentonville, every townsperson became a pair of eyes. Hunters, campers, drivers, shop owners, people walking dogs. The manhunts grew larger than law enforcement alone. Civilians began reporting unusual sounds in the woods. Strangers moving through alleys. Men with tattoos wearing too much clothing for the weather. Every tip became a thread the authorities pulled. In Dannemora, the manhunt evolved further because of human behavior. Escapees always underestimate how predictable their thinking becomes under pressure. Matt was impulsive, and that impulsiveness led him to break into cabins for food. He left signs, moved chairs, open cans, footprints leading toward the tree line. Sweat stayed mobile, avoiding unnecessary stops, but hunger and exhaustion started tightening around him too. Manhunts expose physical limits. In prison, routines dominate life. Set wake-up times, set meals, predictable movement patterns. Outside, escapees go from structure to total unpredictability. Their bodies weaken quickly. Hunger becomes constant. Sleep becomes fragmented and dangerous. Tattoos itch under dirty clothing. Sweat soaks through fabric. Every step becomes heavier. Every noise becomes a threat. Meanwhile, manhunt teams operate with shifts, resources, and support. They rotate. They rest. They plan. Escapees don't. The imbalance grows each day. In Europe, the Pentonville manhunt leveraged digital grids. License plate readers tracked unusual vehicle movement. Phone towers registered stray signals. Wi-Fi networks detected unknown devices passing by. Even if escapees avoided active communication, their movement near certain networks still triggered passive data hits. These microsignals didn't reveal identity, but they helped map patterns, creating a digital trail. The speed of urban manhunts increases because cities are built on order. Deviations stand out. Blocked alleys. CCTV blind spots used too often. Strangers avoiding eye contact. Tattooed silhouettes moving at odd hours. Escapees forget that urban movement requires blending in, not hiding. And blending in is nearly impossible when fear controls behavior. The final stage of manhunts is collapse. For Matt, collapse came when he walked into a wooded clearing and encountered a border patrol team. His exhaustion slowed his reaction. Officers fired. Matt died in the woods, his escape ending with the same suddenness with which it began. For Sweat, collapse arrived 2 days later. He kept pushing south, but officers anticipated his direction. A trooper spotted him near a field. Sweat tried to run, but his body wasn't the body of the man who planned the escape months earlier. Hunger, pain, and exhaustion slowed him. A single shot to the torso brought him down. He survived, but the escape ended the moment he hit the ground. In Pentonville, collapse came through surveillance patterns. Once investigators identified the building where the escapee's contact lived, pressure grew. Officers closed in. Neighbors reported movement. At first, the escapees attempted to flee across rooftops. But London rooftops form unstable grids, slippery tiles, narrow ledges, sudden drops. One wrong step forced them back inside. Tactical teams moved in minutes later. The escape ended without injury, but the humiliation was the same. Their plan, which seemed brilliant inside a prison cell, evaporated the moment it collided with real-world speed and pressure. Manhunts always end with the same reality. The world outside isn't built for fugitives. Not anymore. Technology, people, and pressure create a tightening circle that only closes, never loosens. The escape is the headline, but the manhunt is the story. Lessons the system refuses to forget. When an escape ends, whether with an arrest, a shootout, or a silent surrender, the story inside the prison system does not close. It resets. Every failed escape becomes a blueprint for new policies, new fears, and new debates. Officers examine everything the inmates touched, every tool smuggled, every blind spot exploited. Administrators rewrite procedures. Politicians call for investigations. And the inmates who survive the escape are sent back into a world that looks nothing like the one they left behind. The aftermath of the Dannemora escape forced New York State to face uncomfortable truths. Sweeping audits exposed flaws that had been ignored for years. Guards sleeping through overnight checks, staff bringing unauthorized items into the facility, maintenance teams cutting corners, and long-standing routines that inmates learned to predict with precision. The escape didn't reveal something new. It exposed what had been tolerated. After Sweat was recaptured and Matt was killed, the prison transformed overnight. Tools were inventoried more aggressively. Civilian workers were placed under tighter scrutiny. Relationships between inmates and staff, especially friendly ones, were reevaluated. Mitchell's involvement triggered psychological screenings, stricter boundary training, and reassessments of staffing vulnerabilities. The state realized something many facilities already knew. Manipulation thrives where oversight is weak. Inside the prison system, inmates watched the consequences unfold sharply. The immediate reaction was lockdown. Doors slammed. Movement stopped. Programs were suspended. Tattooed inmates, even those uninvolved, were pulled aside for questioning. Cells were searched daily. Trust evaporated instantly. Guards, already tense from long shifts, became stricter. Infractions that once earned warnings now resulted in discipline. The entire institution felt the weight of two men's actions. The psychological impact on the inmate population was real. Some admired the escape. Others resented it. Many understood the reality. Every failed escape makes life inside harder. Privileges shrink. Suspicion increases. The little comfort prisoners have, routine, gets disrupted. Dannemora was no exception. Men who had nothing to do with the escape endured months of heightened scrutiny, longer waits, slower responses, and unpredictable lockdowns. For staff, the aftermath carried its own consequences. Officers faced investigations, reassignments, and policy changes that questioned their professionalism. In many facilities, officers walk a thin line. They must manage dangerous individuals while working under stress, understaffing, and institutional pressure. The escape exposed weaknesses in training, oversight, and complacency, but it also exposed the unrealistic expectations placed on correctional staff. Across the ocean, the aftermath of the Pentonville escape created similar waves. The discovery of fake bars, smuggled tools, and a flawed security routine forced the United Kingdom's prison service to confront systemic issues. Certain officers were disciplined. Others were reassigned. Metal detectors were upgraded. Inspections increased. Workshops and cells were structurally reinforced. Surveillance patterns shifted. The prison service realized that urban facilities were just as vulnerable as rural ones. Different environment, same weaknesses. Inmate populations in Europe also felt the ripple effect. Tattoos, which often signal gang affiliation or criminal history, became identifiers for heightened monitoring. Staff looked more closely at inmates with known histories of manipulation or violence. Searches became more invasive. Prisoners learned quickly that Pentonville's escape had rewired the system's tolerance levels. But the consequences didn't stop inside prison walls. Public reaction plays a massive role in shaping aftermath policies. When people learn inmates have escaped from a supposedly secure environment, trust in the system drops. Panic rises. Politicians must respond. Media coverage amplifies the pressure. Headlines about tattooed fugitives on the run create images that stick in the public mind. And those images shape policy. The same cycle repeats after every high-profile escape. Public fear leads to political pressure, which leads to rapid reform. But reforms often focus on symptoms, not causes. Better locks, more cameras, new drills. Yet the core problems, overworked staff, overcrowded prisons, weak communication, predictable routines, remain. The aftermath becomes a patchwork of quick fixes instead of deep solutions. For escapees who survive, the aftermath is harsher. Sweat, after his capture, was placed in solitary confinement. No movement without full restraints. No contact with the general population. No chance to use the skills he once used to plan his route out. His tattoos, once symbols of identity inside the inmate world, became visual reminders of everything officers needed to monitor. Escapees rarely return to normal custody. They become high-risk inmates. They lose privileges. Their communication is restricted. Their property is inspected constantly. Their past actions define their future. Even years later, officers remember their names. In Europe, Pentonville's escapees faced similar treatment. Once returned to custody, they were transferred to higher security facilities. They were kept under near-constant monitoring. Every movement was logged. Their access to tools, workshops, and even regular yard time shrank. Escape attempts, even failed ones, mark an inmate for life. Once someone breaks the boundary once, the system never assumes they won't try again. But the aftermath isn't just about punishment. It's also about learning. Prisons study every detail after an escape, not to understand inmates better, but to understand themselves. They analyze the manipulation tactics, the weak routines, the outdated equipment, the blind spots. They attempt to turn failures into preventative strategies. However, there's an uncomfortable truth the system rarely states openly. Every escape exposes vulnerabilities that always existed. The aftermath is not just a correction, it's an admission. An admission that the prison wasn't as secure as it claimed. An admission that complacency had set in. An admission that inmates, despite being locked behind bars, still find ways to outthink the system. In the end, the aftermath becomes a cycle of reflection and fear. Officers fear being blamed. Administrators fear future escapes. Politicians fear public embarrassment. And inmates fear the consequences that follow someone else's mistake. Yet, despite all the aftermath measures, escapes still happen. Because prisons are human institutions, and humans, guards, staff, inmates, make errors, take shortcuts, form connections, and underestimate each other. When jail breaks go wrong, the escape is just the beginning. The aftermath is what reshapes everything.